In 1980, a man in his 80s sat down and wrote the story of his life. Not in a journal, not in a leather-bound memoir. He wrote it on the paper envelope of a 78 RPM record. And when he ran out of room, he kept going. And then he rolled the whole thing around the cardboard tube from a roll of paper towels. For decades, people had asked him personal questions. For decades, he had mostly ignored them. This was his answer, all of it, squeezed onto a record sleeve. That document sits today in the archives of the Mariners Museum Library at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. And somewhere in that life, it describes is a line he liked to repeat. Never set aside a challenge, ever. His name was August Crabtree, and over the course of about 30 years, he built 16 ships so precise, so obsessively correct, that the New York Times would eventually call them the finest collection of miniatures in the world. His wife, Winnifred, put it about as well as anyone could. She said his first words must have been questions. That's his whole personality in one sentence. August Crabtree did not accept that things simply were. He wanted to know what wood this was, why it behaved the way it did, how the man across the street made that joint fit so cleanly. A family friend named Elmer Knight, a cabinet maker, noticed the boy hoarding scraps of wood and decided to do something about it. Knight taught him the trees, the grain, which wood suits which job, how to season it so it doesn't betray you later. Then he showed him carving. Then he handed him 2 small chisels and a hone and taught him how to keep an edge and care for fine tools. Those chisels went straight into the tool collection alongside a pocket knife August already treated like a treasure. He never forgot what Knight taught him. Then came the library, which of course I think is where all of us get started. The Library Association of Portland was offering a class, Sculpture in Wood. Adults only though, and August was just a little boy. He asked what sculpture even meant, and then he asked to be let in, and he kept asking. A librarian he'd befriended put in a good word for him, and the library eventually relented. That class would be the only formal training in art he ever received. Everything else, every technique in 16 museum-grade ships, he taught himself. His father Fletcher was proud of him and built him a workbench with a drawer for those precious tools, and in the reading room of that library, the boy added sculpture to his list of obsessions. Da Vinci and Michelangelo became his heroes. He got into the habit of combing books for details he might want later, a habit that would serve him for the next 70 years. There were chores at home, but every stolen moment went to that bench. He was about 9 years old when he heard about a local craft work contest. Elmer Knight encouraged him to enter and gave him a seasoned hardwood plank about 12 inches square. At his little workbench, August carved a sailing ship on the Columbia River in bas relief, and because he was the kind of person he was, he added a few salmon breaking the surface of the water. The judge took one look and rejected it. As August remembered it decades later, the entry came back with a scornful glare and a sharp rebuke. He didn't do this, a grown-up did this. So in other words, they were accusing him of putting his name on something an adult, very seasoned sculptor would have done. Here's the part I want you to kind of understand about his personality. He said he had the rejection blues for the rest of the day, and then like most kids, he woke up the next morning barely thinking about it. His father laughed when he heard about it because Fletcher understood what the judge had actually said. This is too good to have been made by a child. That's not an insult. That's actually a really good review. He carried the carving down to his Western Union office and put it on display. And a customer saw it, a man who happened to own several Columbia River ships. He was impressed enough to invite the boy aboard one of his sailing barks for a short cruise. Sadly, his father passed away when he was around 12 years old, making him now the sole breadwinner for the home. He grew and eventually moved on to Hollywood. He rented a house on Fox Hills Drive near the 20th Century Fox lot. One room reserved for the Crabtree studio, one workbench for the work he actually cared about, and another for what he called that Hollywood stuff. So see, even the collection that he has on display at the museum is not the entirety of his collection. That was called The Project. He spent a lot of time on that, and that was his, as he would refer to later on, as his children. The things that he did for Hollywood there were hundreds of things that he did for Hollywood. He sculpted, he made miniatures, he made signs, all sorts of things. This Hollywood stuff was just a job. He built models and miniature figures for pictures, The Cavalcade, Mutiny on the Bounty, Treasure Island. He met director Frank Lloyd, who was so impressed he brought August over to MGM and got him a contract. He worked with producer Irving Thalberg. He did freelance work for others. Word spread fast about how good he was, and the list of people who wanted a piece of him reads like a roll call of the era. Selznick, Frank Capra, Preston Sturges, Daryl Zanuck, and of course, DeMille. He met the stars and he had lots of opinions about them. He said the men were easy company. Pat O'Brien, Jimmy Cagney, Edward Everett Horton, all of them open and friendly. The women, though, he thought tended toward the pompous. He also noted, with no particular tact, that Joan Crawford was less impressive without her makeup. But he had real respect for Clark Gable and John Wayne, not as great actors in his estimation, but as serious craftsmen. That was the highest category he had. For such an impressive individual to call someone else a serious craftsman about their art, that was saying something. The work itself would be extraordinary. He sculpted a bust of George Washington in Whitehorn Heartwood at a scale of 1:48. His biggest Hollywood adventure was That Hamilton Woman, for which he carved the trail boards of Nelson's flagship and a plaque bearing Nelson's own words about Emma and country being the dearest objects of his heart. For another picture, he carved 45 bas reliefs. For yet another, 45 figures up to 6 inches tall to populate a ship's deck, and he gave each of them a different facial expression. Did anyone notice? Well, almost certainly not. The camera couldn't see it. That was the problem. In June 1940, the Los Angeles Times ran a piece on him titled Admiral in the Workshop. Jack Warner read it, came by, and made an offer for those model ships. August's answer was a flat no. Not at any price. Even though many of the people in Hollywood offered to purchase his boats from him or other things that he had created, he did not sell any of them. However, and unfortunately, some of those people took those items and they became part of their own personal collection. Now, when the war came, August decided he had to contribute, and he cut the Hollywood connection. When it ended, Hollywood came back calling. He turned them down like that. No, thank you. You don't need me. I'm too good for you. And he was right. His art was art, and he wanted people to see it, not in obscure ways on the screen, but to actually be able to stand face to face with his art. And as someone who has, that is the only way you can appreciate it. Winnifred explained it more gently. He simply refused to cheapen his work, and his own summary of 10 plus years in the movie business is the most Crabtree thing he ever said. The money was good, but he never watched movies himself. A motion picture was his idea of a bad time. He preferred vaudeville, more individual, more imaginative, more personal, really. Which brings us to the woman doing some of the work with him. His perfectionism had outgrown one pair of hands, and he hired an assistant, Winnifred Clark. She buffed the gun walls and every leading edge of those miniature hulls with tiny files, each stroke moving the thing a fraction closer to correct. She kept both workbenches in order. When he needed research, she went to the UCLA library and dug through old volumes of the Illustrated London News, looking for miniature sketches. He proposed, she said yes, and the assistant became the co-author of everything that followed. Enter the Florida connection, because there has to be a connection to Florida in here somewhere, and there was. By 1945, after the war and a long trip east, the fleet was done. 16 ships, what was known as his project, what he and Winnifred simply called the project, or their children. And now August had a new problem, arguably a harder one than carving them. He needed people to see them. Remember, he made so many incredible things for the movies, and although you can see them in movies, there was not that personal aspect of it, and he really wanted his art to be out and among the public. The Mariners Museum in Newport News wanted the collection but didn't have the room. Harold Sniffen kept writing and updates about a new wing and a permanent gallery. August was skeptical and impatient. When the New York Times called his work the finest collection of miniatures in the world, his reaction wasn't pride, it was fine words. But people must see my work. He was, in his own way, an egotist, and he rarely apologized for it. I don't think that egotism is always bad. I think that when someone is good at what they do and they are widely accepted as good as what they do, they should be appreciated for that and acknowledged. We should give honor where honor is due, and he deserved it. Boston, New York, and Washington hadn't given him what he wanted, but he liked the sound of Miami. The Magic City, a seaside tourist mecca, no museum there. Friendly people, though, genuinely interesting in his ships. He could wait a year on someone else's promise, as the Mariners Museum had been giving him, or he could do it himself, something he was very used to and something that is so American. We can do it. When, he bellowed, we're bound for Miami. Winnifred was disappointed, but she went anyway. They bought land on U.S. Highway 1, about 12 miles south of the city. Money was tight, and August, on principle, could not borrow a cent, so he built the museum himself. Fireproof, hurricane-proof, every block, every brick, every piece laid by his own hands. Winifred's only note of complaint in a 1950 letter was a quiet hope that he wouldn't injure his hands. There was a zoning change that took a month, the planning board, a building permit, and in the evenings, after laying block all day, he sat and figured out the next day's problems. The Crabtree Museum opened in December of 1950. Winifred sold the tickets, greeted visitors, and cleaned the place. August gave the tours, and then reality arrived. You see, quite often those who create are not good, nor do they desire to run the in and out everyday aspects of having a business. He had imagined a quiet life, his own museum, and time to keep adding ships. Instead, he got advertising, promotion, licenses, organizations you have to join if you want to get anywhere, and high commercial taxes. He described it as more of a headache than a happiness. Running even a small family business, he said, takes nearly all your time just to keep the business alive, and it left the actual work badly crippled. So in 1955, they sold it and went to Virginia. August drove the fleet north alone. Staff arrived early at the Mariners Museum that September, found a van by the entrance, and a man sitting on the bumper eating a sandwich. Sniffen, by then assistant director of the museum, greeted his friend, and from the look on August's face, knew he was hoping there was still a place for him. There was. Mr. Crabtree, we will always have a place for you. I mean, with a collection that impressive, they better have a place. Winifred stayed behind almost a year to settle the property. Years later, she remembered driving back through Florida and stopping to look at the building her husband raised with his bare hands. And sadly, it had been bulldozed. I want to kind of stop for just a second and talk about one particular piece because it tells you exactly what kind of mind and man that Crabtree was. And it's about the, I'm going to post a picture of it and a short little video. I'm not great at AI animation, but this is what we get for today. 10 seconds of little animation. He made this gondola and it was absolutely incredible. So here's a little bit about the history of that. Francisco Morosini was one of Venice's most aggressive rulers. In 1685, he beat a Turkish fleet off the Dalmatian coast. In 1686, he beat the Greeks off the southern Peloponnese. In the end, it wasn't the Turks who took the Venetian Empire. It was the English and the Dutch and their sailing ships. By 1692, the old aggressor was ready to enjoy his money, and that meant a gondola di fresca, a pleasure boat. Crabtree found it by accident. We're going back to the library. In 1947, digging through the Windener Library at Harvard for something else entirely, he turned up contemporary drawings of the gondola. He said finding them was a byproduct of another research, and that what pulled him in was the intense sculptural detail. Then the attraction turned into a challenge, which for August Crabtree was the same as a decision. Here's what he built: a gondola 7 3/4 inches long, 56 individual figures on it. The whole thing weighs 14.56 grams, a bit over half an ounce. And if you're like me and need a visual, that's about 15 M&Ms. 56 distinct human and animal figures, each with its own posture, on an object lighter than a slice of bread. In his model, there's no gondolier and no oar. The thing is far too ornate to have ever worked a Venetian lagoon. Maybe it never did. We have no idea. My animated video that I'm working to get a little bit better at has a gondolier though. And that is Crabtree in one object. The last chapter is a little bit slower, I guess. The museum company said the value was too high and would only climb. The museum had to own the collection outright. August sold it, and he called that a trying and difficult decision because he had always planned to keep the project as long as he lived. Back then, it was a lot of money. He sold it for about $75,000. But when you look at how much it's worth today, it is projected to be worth, just those few boats that are in the Maritime Museum are projected to be close to about $1 million. However, if they were to be actually valued, it would be priceless, given its historical place in history, given who Crabtree was, and all of the many amazing things that he accomplished in his life. That adds value to each one of these objects. He and Winnifred spent the next 35 years standing in that gallery every week, explaining the ships to whoever walked in and demonstrating carving at a scale most people can't quite believe until they see it. August died in 1994. Winnifred followed in 2005. They never had children. He used to say his models were his children and that he was very proud of them. I keep coming back and thinking about the record sleeve and how he was so invested in his work and what he was doing that he never really bothered to write down much of this stuff. What he wrote down wound up being kind of an afterthought. There's a particular kind of American in that way of thinking, and I don't think we make many of them anymore. A man who found one difficult thing and decided he would be the best in the world at it, and then arranged his entire life around that decision. He turned down Hollywood, money, because the work was too small for him. Not in size, in seriousness. He was a serious artist. He laid every brick of his own museum because he wouldn't borrow. He got called a fraud at 9 and gave it one day of self-pity and then picked right back up again. He said the class was for adults and asked to be let in anyway. Never set aside a challenge, ever. That's not a motivational poster. For him, it was a method. It was his life. When something is hard, that is the reason to do it, not the reason to look for something easier. And the reward itself, fame or money, it's that somewhere in Newport News, Virginia, there's a room where you can stand 2 feet from a ship the size of a bread box and see the individual blocks and the rigging and understand that a man decided you deserve to see that you deserve to see it, not just on a giant screen somewhere, but right there in front of you. Remember, not a single piece of it was applied with glue. It was all done by hand and created with tiny little pegs. 16 ships, 1 lifetime, no shortcuts. He did the hard thing. You don't get much more American than that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all the things. And next week, we will be learning about the Royal Poinciana Hotel. This really cool postcard that I found while on vacation, and it has a lot of writing on it. So stay tuned next week for a little bit more about Florida history and how we can connect with it, learn from it, and especially from people who lived almost 100 years ago.